Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, if you were to read through the book of Acts from beginning to end, you would note that one of the main themes of the book is that the risen Christ sometimes shows up in the church. Sometimes the church is so shaped by the life of Christ, so carefully, that ordinary folk in the church like you and me look like Jesus. As scholar Willie Jennings says, the church repeats Jesus. Now that may sound like a fantasy to you, but it is a witness from the early church that I find both hopeful and challenging. The story we read from Acts is a story about Peter, that first string apostle who, along with Paul, the outsider, gave shape to the early church. Here, Peter is summoned to Joppa because a beloved saint of the church there had died. Her name was Tabitha, although some called her Dorcas. We haven't heard of her before, and we don't hear of her again after this moment, but her death is important enough that the saints of Joppa, they summon Peter. We learn 2 things about Tabitha. One is that she has 2 names, and the other is that she was devoted to good works and acts of charity. As the hymn we just sang stated it, she was kind. Peter comes and he repeats Jesus. You may remember the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. Jesus is summoned. He arrives. She has died. He pushes everyone out of the room and he speaks to the little girl, "Get up." And the dead girl breathes. So here, Peter is summoned. He pushes everyone out of the room. He looks to Tabitha and says, "Get up." And the dead woman breathes. Now, I'm not going to pretend I can explain that. I'm not going to pretend that I think we can do the same. I've been hanging around the church for a long time, and I've never seen the power of Christ show up in just this way. And yet, this story is important for us. It is a story about Peter, yes, but even more so, it is a story about this woman named Tabitha. That's her Aramaic or Jewish name. That's how Peter would have known her. But her Greek friends, they called her Dorcas. Both names mean or translate gazelle, and unless I completely miss it, I assume she is remembered as the gazelle woman because she darted around her community, engaging in acts of kindness. I also think that's why she has 2 names. One is not big enough, Because a name demonstrates belonging. When I was a kid, I was called Tommy. Tomar was my dad, and I was called Tommy. And every now and then I'll get an email or a Facebook message and it'll start, "Dear Tommy," and I don't have to read anymore. I know this is from someone with ties to Shalford Church in Atlanta, and they remember me as Tommy and take great pride in holding on to that name. When I was in college, my suite mates gave me a nickname. And were you to mention that name, it would immediately take me back to Smythe 305, where I lived with these guys. That would be a sweet journey in memory. It's not going to happen because unless you think in this buildup I'm going to tell you that name, there is no way I'm telling you. Not wild horses could pull that name from my lips. But the point is, I wonder if this woman went by two names because in a way she belonged to everyone, which is something of a miracle. A little church history. The most difficult, complex, all-consuming social issue of the church, of the early church, was the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. The most difficult social issue of the early church was about race. For 1,000 years, Jews had been set apart from Gentiles. As a matter of fact, one way to define what it is to be Jewish is you're not Gentile. You're not them. They didn't share meals. They didn't share worship. They didn't share table. They didn't share language. They were divided. Now, if you read all the way to the end of Acts, a miracle happens. The most amazing thing, because in the church, the division between Jew and Gentile is being bridged, and Jews and Gentiles discover that they are actually family with one another. They worship together, they eat together, they learn to love one another. Oh, don't let me romanticize that too much. You know how this is. It was complicated and human, and there were issues. But still, the division that was assumed eternal, the division that was assumed to be just natural, the decision that was assumed to be even blessed by God, was being bridged. It was remarkable. But before we get to that, there's this woman with two names, who, if I understand the text, lives as something of a bridge between divided communities. Her name is Tabitha. That's how Peter would have known her, by her Jewish name, but her heart was too big to be claimed by just one people, so she was also known as Dorcas. That's the name her Gentile friends gave her. So how did she bridge these two communities? I think it's because she was kind. When Peter came, it says the widows of the community, they gathered around holding tunics and shawls that Tabitha had made for them. She had darted from need to need, bringing gifts, showing kindness. To Tabitha, it didn't matter who you were. It just mattered that you were in need. It didn't matter if your need was because you were victimized in some way, or maybe you were in need because you'd just been dumb and made stupid decisions. It didn't matter to her. She was just kind. And you know, I think kindness is a power. This past spring, my wife, Carol, and I, we took our young adult children and we went to Scotland and Northern Ireland for a brief visit. I had never been before, and part of our itinerary, we had to journey by train from Edinburgh to Oban so that we could ferry over to the Isle of Iona. We had to change trains in Glasgow, and there we were, 4 Americans, the first time there, trying to figure out the train system. We obviously looked like fish out of water. There was a gentleman there who worked for the train. He said, "How may I help?" We said, "We're really hoping there's a train to Oban from here." And he said, "Oh, of course, but it's not for an hour and a half. Why don't you enjoy the city? Go out and enjoy this beautiful day." It was raining. And he said, "Go and have lunch and then come back and you can catch the train." I said, "Well, our tickets won't work a second time. We'd have to buy a new." He said, "Oh, no, don't worry, mates. I'll let you in." Well, I'm here to tell you it happened just that way. With a little anxiety, I led my family out of the train station. We had lunch. We enjoyed the rain. And when we came back, there was the guy with the hat. And he said, "Oh, cheerio, come hitherforth." And there's your train. And off we went to Oban. My son, who lives in New York City, said, "This would never happen back home." It was kindness. And the kindness extended to me made me feel in a surprising way that I wasn't really an outsider. I was welcomed, and I might even belong in this country that was new to me. Kindness is a power. So why do we even talk about this? Why does this matter? Why did the church keep this story for us? Because sometimes when we endeavor to be faithful, we believe that what we need to be is not kind, but right. Not kind, but pure. And that inevitably leads us to separate, to push away those who aren't right, those who aren't pure, to wall it off, if you will. We walked through Belfast with Paul. He's a historian and a mediator, and on very personal levels, he talked to us about that period of time they call the Troubles. It's the violence between Catholics and Protestants. Presbyterians were very much a part of that struggle. There was a time when religion was used to destroy community under the guise of purity. Of course, that happens here too. It was just last April, a young man walked into a Jewish synagogue and began shooting. In this particular shooting, and I hate that this is so common among us that I have to refer to it that way as this particular shooting, the shooter was a nursing student, someone who clearly cared about folks, a nursing student. His name was John Ernest, and he was Presbyterian. Now, he wasn't of our denomination, thank goodness. He was Orthodox Presbyterian, a conservative group that broke out of us in 1936. But don't expect your neighbors to split that hair. He was Presbyterian, and he said he engaged in violence because that's what his faith taught him to do. In the wake of 9/11 and other acts of violence, many Muslim clerics stood up and said, "This violence is not of Islam." Unfortunately, it is our time to do the same now and say this violence is not of us. There is nothing in Christian faith that supports that kind of hatred of neighbor. Ernest spoke of it as white nationalism. There's nothing in our faith that supports racism. There's nothing in our faith that supports nationalism, actually, because Christian faith is to build community, even where none had existed before. That's why we know about this woman with two names. She bridged a divided people, and they couldn't forget her. So on a trip, our church does a trip to Kenya. We were on a trip back. We landed in Philly and then went to Chicago. And to make a very long story short, after 27 hours of being awake and in the air and having multiple flights canceled, we were stuck in Chicago for the night. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife and I, we got a cab ride to a hotel, and it was the worst cab ride in the history of wheels. the defroster on the cab didn't work, and so the cabbie had the window down so he could reach out and do this. That meant the rain could come in on us in the back seat. And at one point in broken English, he asked me if I had a phone. I said, yes, I have a phone. He said, well, my map thing doesn't work. You're going to have to tell me how to get there. I was not exceedingly kind. I wasn't mean. I was just what my family has learned to call short. Here it is, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm telling the guy, turn right at the next light. I said, it's not my job to tell you how to get there. You're supposed to get us there. Turn right at the next light. We got to our hotel. My wife, Carol, who often repeats Jesus, she asked me, Tom, just what do you think that man's life is like? From his language, it was clear he hadn't been in our country very long. His cab was in terrible shape, which meant he had the lowest status at the cab company. If he's like some other immigrants that I had known, I imagine he had spent the daytime hours emptying trash cans at a nursing home or working a loading dock, and he's spending the nighttime hours driving a cab even at 2 o'clock in the morning. She said, it looks like he is doing everything he can to make it and is barely hanging on. The least you could do is be kind. And I was ashamed. And I was so grateful that he did not know I was Christian, much less a pastor. For then he would know I did not just shame myself, but my Lord. He was African. I could tell that. He might have been Christian himself. And there was an opportunity for me to repeat Jesus, and I chose not to. Somehow I had let the witness of this woman with 2 names slip my mind. She was a friend to everyone in her community. Like a gazelle, she darted from need to need, bringing kindness. I think Luke lingers with this disciple with 2 names to remind the church that we are nothing if we are not kind. Philip Simmons was a former English professor at Lake Forest College in Illinois. At the age of 35, he was diagnosed with ALS. He battled that disease for 10 years, and during that time, he wrote a beautiful little book called Learning to Fall. And in it, he wrote this: we know we are truly grown-ups when we stop trying to fix people. About all we can really do for people is love them and treat them with kindness. Others don't need fixing so much as they need kindness. I think that is true. I also wonder if in this divided, fractured, disrespectful culture of ours, I wonder if a consistent practice of kindness could work a miracle or two. Let me tell you about my friend David. I'll tell you that and then I'm finished. He was a one-shingle attorney in Jacksonville, Florida. David's wife, Winky, and I'm not making that up, that's really her name, Winky, she was a great football fan, and David was a great cook. And so when the church school class met at their house for a cookout, Winky would be in the backyard with the guys debating the attributes of zone defense, and David would be in the kitchen swapping recipes for lemon meringue pie. He never called attention to himself, to my knowledge, was never on a board, never served on a committee, never had a leadership position. His resume would fit on a Post-it note with extra room. He was no mover and shaker. The only thing I can tell you about David is that every time I saw him, I said, David, how are you? And he said, I'm better now that I've seen you. He said, you got a minute? Sit down. Tell me about everything. I just want to know about everything. He went to the doctor because he had a cough. Within a week, he was gone. We held his service, and that church is about the size of this church. We couldn't get everybody in. We even let folks sit in the choir loft and stand against the side walls. Don't tell the fire marshal. Folks still couldn't get in, and so there were a lot of folks that stood out in the Florida heat just because, well, I think because he convinced us that he was better once he had seen us. It was kindness. We all carried our memories of his kindness. We carried them to that sanctuary like blankets and tunics of offerings of kindness, and we laid them before God as our prayer of gratitude for this life of kindness in our midst. Kindness is a power. Tabitha was kind. I'm sure the people she cared for are like people you know, some of them brooding, some of them depressed, some of them angry at the cards life has dealt them, some of them completely self-absorbed. She didn't try to fix any of that. She was just kind. So here's what I think. I think our world could use a little of that. I think our country could use a little of that. You know, community is not a given. America is not a given. It's a choice. And I think we need a miracle or two. We're being eaten alive by self-righteousness on the right and on the left, and hand-wringing apathy in the middle. Not all of it is violence, but the kind of arrogance and dismissiveness of neighbor, it sows seeds of violence. And suspicion of one another is in the air that we breathe. We need a resurrection. We need kindness for the stranger and the foreigner, for the immigrant, the one of a different faith, the one who's just not like us for whatever way it is. You know, people who are divided can actually be brought together in community. It's happened before. So I think that's why we know of this remarkable woman with two names. And we know of her because she was kind. So I suggest a practice of kindness. And perhaps the risen Christ will show up in the church so clearly that even in ordinary folks like us, we repeat Jesus. Now I know we're Presbyterians, and so we don't think about miracles very much. But let's practice kindness and just see what Jesus is able to do with that. Pray with me. Gracious God, we believe. Help our unbelief. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.